Hello there and welcome to the channel. This is Nerd of War. This is the channel that's splintered off from my Nerd.World history channel, which is linked in the description below if you want to check that out. There are videos on there that are linked to this one. That channel has become something of a passion project of mine, mostly into prehistoric Celtic history. And as a result, as I have a love of many different types of history, but the YouTube algorithms placed that channel specifically to that stuff, so anything else I upload just doesn't go anywhere, I made this channel to explore military history. And today we're looking at the Battle of Medway. And if you're not familiar with it, I'm not surprised. It's not a very well-known battle. It took place in 43 AD and was between the Romans and the native British Celts during their invasion. Before we get started, please like, share, subscribe, comment down below, and again, if the Celts are something that you're interested in, I have another channel, Nerd.World History, that is fully dedicated, more or less, to them and their history, where I've been doing a complete breakdown of Celtic lore, history, and the different tribal nations that once existed in the ancient world. With that said, you may have come from Nerd.World History, and in that case, hi. And let me know in the comments below if you did. And for now, let's get started with the Battle of Medway. Right, so to understand the Battle of Medway, let's start with who was fighting it. On the one side, we have the Celts, led by Chariot, who was the war leader and chieftain of the Cadavalani tribe, and basically the High King of the Britons. That's a very, very loose term, and I do have a dedicated video to him, again, over on Nerd.World History. But, short version, he was the leader of the Celtic army in this battle. And on the Roman side, we have a few notable individuals, and we'll start with one. We've got Vespasian. If that name is familiar to you, he was one man who was going to go on to become Emperor of the Roman Empire in about 20 years from these events. At this time, he was a legate in the Roman army in 43 AD. He was born in 9 AD as Titus Flavius Vespianus. By this point, as I said, he'd risen through the ranks in the Roman army and become a legate and was involved in the invasion of Britannia and was one of the commanders of the Roman army at this time. But the overall Roman commander was a man named Aulus Plautius. He had been appointed by Emperor Claudian to lead the invasion of Britannia. Now, the basic backstory behind the Roman invasion is one that'll need covering, but that'll probably be on my other channel. But in short, there was a Celtic tribe called the Atrebates. Their leader, Verica, wasn't happy with his neighbour, the Cadavalani. They were basically pushing him around. They'd invaded his territory and they had basically kicked him out of his own kingdom. He asked the Romans for help. Now, the Romans were just looking for a reason to invade, and that was the only impetus they needed. And his mandate was initially to restore Verica as the chieftain of the Atrebates, as the Atrebates and Verica were allies of Rome. But as I said, this would now make them a client state because the Romans were here and they weren't leaving. But that was basically the match that got everything started. Once the Romans were in, they began to march across Britannia. The Cadavalani were quite opposed to the Romans and they sent an army to fight them. The two forces would meet at the River Medway in southeast England. Now on the other side you had Caraticus, or Caradog, to give him what is probably the actual pronunciation of his name without it being Laticized. He was born some point in the early 1st century AD. His exact birth date is unknown. He became the chieftain of the Cadavalani, who were the most powerful tribe in southern Britannia, and by default practically the most powerful tribe in the entire British Isles at the time. Although they were not really the most militaristic, they were certainly one of the most organized, if not the most fanatical. They had already subjugated, or by way of dominion, taken control of practically every neighbouring tribe to them, in the whole, meaning that they basically controlled the whole of southern Britannia, either by direct rule or, as I say, via proxy, via dominion, by basically putting their own puppets in charge. They were very and strongly anti-Roman. The Cavalloni wanted nothing to do with Rome or its trappings. They were a tribe that the Romans hadn't effectively been able to seduce into the empire. And Caraticus, either through patriotism on possibly some level, or through religious fervour or just general hatred, for whatever reason, he was not a fan of the Romans, and the Cavalloni as a whole were not. The Atrebates, however, a tribe who they had subjugated, were big fans of the Romans and wanted to be Roman. They were the ones, practically, mainly, who invited the Romans in, as I mentioned earlier. So, now that we know the commanders, let's have a look at what the armies were made of on these two sides. Now, I think we can all agree that we don't really need much introduction to the Roman army, but let's go through it in brief. The average Roman centurion, or legionnaire, or whatever you want to call them, was typically a heavily armoured infantryman. Battle-hardened, well-drilled, well-trained, well-fed. They were capable of marching 10-20 miles a day, depending on the commander and how well-drilled and how tough the army was and where they were. They were extremely proficient at fortification building. They were proficient engineers. They were extremely close as a military unit. They had broad rectangular shields with a hardened metal center. They would typically carry a throwing spear, which would be the first weapon that they would use. This would bend at the point of hitting its target, meaning the enemy couldn't pick it up and throw it back. They had a short stabbing sword, which was originally a gladiator weapon. This is good for stabbing and somewhat slashing, but they would typically poke it through the shields, a lot of the time attacking the people attacking their neighbour rather than the person attacking them. The whole image of the Roman army in the turtle formation is a fully different thing and wouldn't have been employed in this. That was involved in siege breaking tactics. But the Roman army would break up into divisions of about 100 men across several deep, and they would just pile at the enemy. The armour that they wore was quite famous, is known as lorica segmentata, which was basically a series of slit armour plate, all sort of banded together by small copper or bronze, sometimes iron, little rings that would hold it all together. Interesting tidbit, most Roman soldiers, they were not issued their armour, they were actually expected to buy it. The concept of armies being issued armour and weapons is a relatively modern concept, even to the ancient world, to the Romans, the infamous and famous army that they were. They actually had to buy their own armour, but the point is they did, and they had it. They also were all issued with a helmet. The idea as well of it being a gleaming, shining force moving towards you is not true. Bear in mind that stainless steel is a relatively modern invention. The armour would have been dull. However, it would have been strong. Every soldier in the Roman army was armed, armoured, and was basically the super soldier of his day. We're talking about the best drilled, best trained, best equipped, and most efficient war machine the ancient world had ever seen to that date. And then what do we have on the other side? Now, there are a lot of misnomers about Celts in war. And I'm going to dispel a few of them here. Celts did not fight naked. Many of the things we know about Celts in war come from Roman accounts, as the Celts didn't write very much down. There's a famous statue of a naked Gaul Celt, which was carved in the ancient world in celebration of the Roman conquest. Things like this add to the image that the ancients, before the Romans turned up, fought naked. The Victorians as well were very, very bad for blackening some of their own history. And there's this image that they were primitive savages in the north, all across Europe. I'm not just talking about Britannia here. And it took the Romans to come along and civilize them. That's not the case. However, it is also not the case that these were an equally well-oiled or well-drilled fighting machine. It's not to say that there were many Celts that were not proficient warriors, but the style of war fought by particularly by the Britons, even versus that of the Gauls on the continent, was very different to what the Romans would do. The people here The Romans were very much about unit and uniformity. The average Roman soldier was shorter than the average Celt. They were not as well built physically. The average Briton was much taller and much stronger. It made them visually more intimidating, and it only served to make the Romans work more cohesively as a unit. They would stick together, defend each other, protect their flanks and protect each other, whereas the Celts were much more about individualistic warfare. Head hunting and other such things, and trophy hunting in battle were quite common. They wanted to be seen, they wanted to be the loudest, the biggest on the battlefield. Now, I'm not going to say that there weren't any Celts that never fought naked. I can't say that for certainty, but I definitely know they didn't all. Being British as well, this country's cold. They didn't fight naked. It's ridiculous. They may have painted their skin blue and dyed their hair white with woad and other such things. Now, the average Celt, you got to think of it as being a bit like the medieval period. The average Celtic warrior may not have had a sword, but a farming fork or a scythe is just as good. There were, however, a small number of warrior elites amongst the Celts who did have armour, did have helmets, did carry swords, spears, and those such things. Although swords were relatively common, probably more common than you would imagine, I doubt that every Celtic warrior had one that was in the battlefield. But they all would have had a knife, even if it was just a knife they used around the house, and many of them would have had shields. Amongst the warrior elite, this is the best amongst that the Britons would have been able to field. They would have all carried a shield, a wooden shield with a metal centre. They would have had a rounded helmet, typically, and they would have had chainmail armour. Interesting, again, side note going into this, the Roman army tended to take different weapons and technologies off the different nations that they conquered. Their shield came from one culture. Their helmets came from another. I believe the helmet was actually Celtic in design. It was based on Gaulish and Germanic designs. Their swords, as I said, they were gladiator weapons. And chainmail armour that was also used by the Romans in later eras was actually also Celtic, developed by Celts. It was used in Britain, it was used in Ireland, it was used in France, which otherwise known as Gaul, and it was used in Germany and Spain. That was actually a Celtic form of armour. So the very best warriors the Celts would have had to throw at the Romans would have had armour, probably with some kind of woolen padding behind it. They would have had a helmet, they would have had a shield, they would have carried a sword, a spear, and nets and other such things were also fairly common for the Celts to use. But when it came to proficiency and professionalism, the Celts were not on the same level as the Romans. They relied on numbers, and they preferred, as I said, to be much more individualistic in warfare. So they had long swords compared to the Roman short swords. They would swing around much more, lobbing off heads hither and there, but it meant that they needed space around them. They didn't like close quarter fighting, and that's important to remember with the Celts. The Battle of Medway would last approximately 2 days. It was preceded by 2 earlier skirmishes, smaller engagements the Celts had made against the Romans, which had been unsuccessful and the Celts had been routed. Now, one thing the Britons were good at was hit and run tactics. It would be used to great effect in the north, and it was quite good on the beaches. They were renowned for their chariot warfare. In fact, ancient Celtic chariots, although from a Roman point of view were an archaic style of warfare, the Britons had perfected chariot warfare, and they would use it in various different ways, but one of the ways they would use it is they would charge in on the chariot, throwing spears, arrows, slings, whatever, at the Romans. Warriors would debark from the chariot, throw into the fray and would attack, while as the chariot retreated, tired or injured warriors would jump on and be pulled away to recover, get something to eat, drink, patch their wounds, and then go back. And the warriors that were dropped off last time, they're picked up, brought back, and so on. It was one of the things they were quite good at. And this particular battle, it wasn't going to be overly useful, but I just thought I would mention it because I'll get to it in a little bit, but basically the Romans made a point of trying to wipe out all of the chariot horses the Celts had. Now, although the actual exact location of the battle is never mentioned or by name or anything else, it is typically believed that the battle did take place at the Battle of Medway. One of the first major blows to the Celts under Caratacus before the battle had even taken place, aside from losing the 2 minor skirmishes, the Dabuni tribe, one of the major tribes that the Caravoloni had previously subjugated, had surrendered to the Romans. This was a morale destroying moment for the Celts. It lost them great resources, it also lost them a lot of prestige, but it was also a boost to the Romans. It took manpower in the form of warriors that were of the Dabuni tribe away from Caratacus' army. It also brought them to the Romans. The Romans were not against using auxiliaries. On the first day of the actual battle, the Celts had camped on the other side. Now, the Romans had also brought auxiliaries from the continent, which Cassius Dio merely described as Celt, but it is believed that they were of Belgic origin. They forded across the river, and they were able to attack the Celts, particularly, again, as I said, they would target the horses for the chariots, killing many of them, taking away one of the Celts' primary forms of weapons. In the meantime, the main heavier Roman infantry was fording the river and was able to attack the Celts, who were taken completely by surprise that such heavily armoured troops had been able to basically get across the river and attack them, something they didn't believe would be possible. These forces were spearheaded by Legio II Augusta, directly under Vespasian, the future emperor of Rome. The overall commander of this particular wing was Titus Flavius Sabinus, but this day would end inconclusively for the two sides. As dusk came, the battle was pressed by the Romans, but unfortunately were not able to secure victory on the first day. The second day, another attack led by a Roman named Geta would again hit the Celts hard, but he would nearly be captured during the battle, but his troops would be able to engage and then force the local British warriors to flee, preventing their commander from being captured. He would later be awarded a significant battle honour for this, being awarded a triumph, an honour not often given to a lower ranking officer. Again, although this was technically a Roman victory, the Celts were routed, not defeated, and they were driven back to another position at the River Thames, which was a little more secure. The whole impetus behind the battle from the Celtic point of view, Caratacus' plan upon learning that the Romans had landed in Britannia, he was hoping to cut them off and contain them in the southeast, in the area that is now known as Kent, the territory of the Canti, another tribe that the Caravoloni had some sway over to a degree. And their hope was to box them in. One of the many things that the Romans are credited for is the building of roads in Britannia. It's not entirely true. There were roads here before the Romans turned up. It's just many of them weren't as formally constructed as what the Romans had. And the Romans had basically followed one of these old roads, which were, to be fair, a little more than trackways, but many of them were purposely constructed. It's just the way they were built here was different to how the Romans made them. They were made with a bank and ditch method, which basically they would have a ditch on either side with an embankment, and then it would be raised up in the middle and flattened off. But they wouldn't put stones down very often. Occasionally they would have trackways which would have wood, which would use wood and planks. This was used for fording boggy areas, but besides the point. His plan was he cut them off along these lanes. As the Romans marched up these roads, he cut them off, but unfortunately was not able to fully contain them, and the Romans were able to break out, and from here they spread across the south coast, and they would begin to penetrate more into the Midlands, into the heartland, which was the territory primarily controlled by the Caravoloni. And that was the Battle of Medway. It's a significant battle mainly for the reason that it was the first major pitched battle between the Romans and the local British tribes. It was not just the Caravoloni who were involved in the battle, but it was led by them. It gave the Romans a feel for who their enemy was going to be, who was leading them, what kind of tactics they were to expect. And it opened up, with the defeat of this battle, the way into the heartland of Britannia and access to the other more belligerent tribes that were really putting up resistance to them. So, that's, as I said, the Battle of Medway. And if you are interested in learning more about the Celts, I am, admittedly, not a historian, but I am someone that is very passionate about history. And I do love it. Military history, Celtic history, prehistory, I have a serious love of it, but just because it's so much more interesting because it's not written down for you. You can use your imagination much more in the pre-Roman period. So if you go to my other channel, Nerd.World History, you'll find I've done extensive work on these tribes. Now, to be clear again, to reiterate, not a historian, my goal is to open up a discussion about them and also to make people more aware that they weren't just primitive savages who needed the Romans to come along and civilize them, make their civitas and make them Roman. They weren't just sat around picking their teeth with bones, living in caves, just hoping and praying for one day the Romans to come along and tell them how to build houses and hypercausts and roads and all the other things that for the most part they already had before the Romans turned up. Just they tended to formalize things and make it look Roman. Anyway, if that is something you're interested in, check out the link in the description below, or possibly on a card if I remember, for Nerd.World History. And on this channel, like, share, subscribe, and comment down below if you're aware of the Battle of Medway, or if you're here because you thought it was the Battle of Midway and you clicked on the wrong video. Because completely different type of battle. With all that said, if you made it to the end, thank you for watching, and bye-bye.